Welcome back, everyone. I am here with Dr. Paul Smith, who is a famous remote viewer from the 1980s, 90s, and today as well. So welcome, Paul. It is a pleasure to finally meet you.
Well, thank you. I'm actually looking forward to this. You seem like a nice guy with intelligent questions, so this is going to be fun.
Well, I'll probably disabuse you of that notion later in this call. But let's just start with brass tacks. Tell me a little bit about your journey in the U.S. military. Briefly what you did before, in the days before you joined the remote viewing program, and how you got assessed and recruited for that particular program, timelines, etc.
Okay. Well, I actually enlisted to be an Arabic linguist in 1976. I was at Brigham Young University, newly married, wanting to get a degree in Middle Eastern Studies. Had taken lots of Hebrew classes, but BYU at that time didn't offer Arabic classes. It now does. And my then wife said, well, if you want to learn Arabic, and we're basically starving here, the Army's got a language program, they'll pay you to learn Arabic. And I at first didn't really want to join the Army, and I went down and talked to the recruiter, and that was my big mistake because they talked me into it, right? So I ended up enlisting and going off and getting Arabic language training.
Let me stop you there. You're actually lucky that they actually sent you to Arabic training. For all you know, you could have been like, "Oh, thanks for signing up. Now you're gonna maintain
back then,
helicopter engines."
Specified Arabic language training, and they had been hammered by various congressmen for not honoring contracts. So I was definitely going. Now, the unfortunate thing was that if I had signed up 2 weeks later, I would have got a $20,000 signing bonus. But and they didn't tell me that. They didn't tell me that was coming because they wanted their quota and they were afraid they'd lose me. So that would have been awesome, but it didn't happen. So I ended up going to Arabic language training, and that's a long process. That's a year and a half of training after basic training, and then they sent me to the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to be in what they called a COMEX, a Communications Exploitation Platoon. So in other words, I was there, but we didn't have really any big mix-ups in the Middle East at the time. So I spent almost my whole time doing motor stables. So changing oil in Jeeps, making sure the air pressure was right in Gamma Goat tires and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, there's got to be something better than this. And one of my friends decided he was going to apply for OCS, Officer Candidate School. And he asked me if I'd just go around and kind of hold his hand because he was a little bit nervous about the process. And I ended up doing it with him, and he ultimately got rejected and I got accepted. So I ended up going to OCS at Fort Benning. And after OCS, after I graduated, I sort of blundered into airborne training and got trained as a paratrooper, more or less. 5 jumps, you become an expert after 5 jumps, right? Not something I was thrilled about. I enjoyed jumping out of the airplane and floating down, but those landings were always, I hit like a sack of bricks every time. And it wasn't the most pleasant experience from that perspective. But anyway,
lots of broken legs too.
People do get those. I was fortunate I didn't, although I almost brained myself on one. I don't know if you want these kind of war stories, but we were jumping these T-10 chutes, which aren't steerable. That you just go out and you go where the wind wants you to. And the problem with them is they can start to oscillate sometimes. And mine started going because it was a hot day and I hit some thermals, I think, over the drop zone. But it starts oscillating and really it's going really bad. And I come down backwards on a downward oscillation. Whack! It's like it cracked a whip, knocked my helmet up over my eyes, bent my glasses, and kind of stunned me. I was laying there, and one of the TAC sergeants comes running up. Sir, you okay? I ain't never seen anybody land that hard. It was interesting. It kind of put me off wanting to do that. But I went off to further training, and through a set of circumstances which were really kind of unpredictable, I ended up going to be the intelligence officer of a special forces unit in Germany. And that turned out to be really an awesome assignment. It was great. Two weeks of the winter, you were mandated to go do downhill ski training on a local German ski slope. So I learned how to ski at taxpayers' expense. It was a winter warfare unit. That was one of their assignments. Yeah. So they even wanted the staff to at least know their way around on skis. And so I got to do that. It was pretty awesome.
Did you get lessons or did you just
Oh
trying to
yeah,
figure
we
it out
got
on your own.
training. Well, see, a special forces mission, people think their job is to go kick doors and shoot people, right? And they do that, but their main job is to teach other people to do that. The idea is you drop a special forces A team behind enemy lines. They go up, round up a battalion size, roughly 500 partisans, train them how to be effective fighters, and then provide the kind of core support that battalion size unit needs to go out and harass the enemy behind enemy lines. And so anytime they get a chance to teach anything, they do it because it helps improve their teaching skills and that kind of thing. And so they taught the ski training, and they were quite good. They were really quite good.
So you learned ski training, and this is in Bad Tolz,
Germany, yeah.
And what sort of intelligence work did you do for the Special Forces unit? Because it had a huge scope, right?
Yeah, this is kind of unique. At that time, the area of operations for this particular unit was all of Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, Middle East, North Africa, Western Europe, if it ever came to that. And they needed intelligence ranging all the way from the current deployment of Soviet strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, all the way down to the boot print pattern of Czech border guards. And that was a huge scope of information that they required. And it was really a fascinating job, I have to tell you. It was really interesting.
And this is a random question, but at the time that you were at Bad Tolz, is that the same time they had those Davy Crockett man-portable nuclear weapons?
Let's just say it might have been.
Okay, I had to ask the question.
Yeah, it could have been.
Yeah, understood. And then while you were there, what periods of time were you at Bad Tolz? What years?
So that was from 1979 to 1982.
Okay, so that was slightly before, or maybe a year before Noble Archer. I think that was 83, where they had that large exercise and maybe incident, pretty much close to the peak of the Cold War.
I thought you were going to say that was just a year before I was born, before you were born.
No, I was thinking of that earlier in the discussion, but I didn't. I kept my mouth shut.
Yeah.
Follow up on the boot print pattern. What kind of information could you elicit that? Is it just basically like if the Russians were manning it, or the East Germans, or
they could tell who they were dealing with if they were being tracked, or if they were tracking somebody, they know who they're doing. But also, if they were infiltrating on foot, they were playing with the idea of having a certain boot print pattern on their own boots, so that people wouldn't realize it was Americans sneaking in, right? So
interesting. Okay.
I don't know that they ever did anything with that. First of all, that's very hard information to get. You probably wouldn't be surprised at how difficult it would be to find out. These days it'd be easy because there are probably tons of Czech border guard. Well, no, Czech border guard boots on the surplus market. You could probably buy them, and something like that you might find on the internet today. But I probably ought to do it sometime just for the fun of it, see what turns up. So anyway, that was great, even despite the monthly parachute jump, which I never looked forward to. But, I survived. Well, after that, I went back for more training at Fort Huachuca and got assigned to Fort Meade as a Mideast desk analyst. And I was working partly the Iranian problem and partly just about anything else that came down the pike. And I was in that job for 3 months.
Oh, by the way, what year were you? Did you join?
That would have been 83. In May of 83 is when I got to Fort Meade. And
then when was the Beirut bombing?
It was 82 or 83. I right now don't remember the date. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that's on me, because I know 87 was when activity in the Persian Gulf really spiked, because I think we effectively sank the Iranian Navy. Most people don't realize that, but in 87, that's effectively what happened.
So it really got dicey starting in 88, of course, because that's when, no, that's not right. Okay, so Russia invaded Afghanistan in 1980. And was it 82 to 88 or somewhere in there, the Iraqis and the Iranians got into a big fight, right?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Really well. I think it was 82 to 88, or it might have been 80 to 88. Those two mixed it up. And of course, that heated things up in the Gulf pretty heavily. We were providing intelligence and other support to the Iraqis, ironically. against the Iranians. And well, that's a story we can get to in a little bit. So let me go back to Fort Meade here.
Yep.
So what I was not aware of, and I'm going to tell you how I got into the remote viewing program now, because I know that's one of your questions. I got this assignment at Army Operations Group is what they called it, just doing Mideast related intel stuff. And what I didn't know is I'd moved in next door to the training and operations officer of the remote viewing unit and across the street from one of the newest remote viewing training person, right? So
is that Fern Gavin? Oh, no. Skip Atwater. Okay.
No, Skip Atwater is next door to me. He went by Fred back then, so Fred Atwater. And Tom McNair lived across the street. In fact, I and Tom had kids about the same age. Our wives became friendly. They're probably our best friends at Fort Meade during that period. But of course, I was friends with Skip as well. And I couldn't figure out what they did because they always wore civilian clothes, even though their door said Captain Thomas McNair, Captain Fred Atwater, right? Tom had a full beard. He always wore jeans and an open collar shirt. Skip always walked around with I forget what you call those kind of shirts that Panamanians wear all the time. And I wonder, what are they doing? I mean, normally speaking, if you live on a military post, you wear a uniform, even if you're in like human intelligence, because then you change into something else when you go out and to do your job, right? But these guys were always in civilian clothes. And I asked them one time, I said, well, what do you guys do? They said, well, we can't tell you. I said, well, I know you can't tell me what you do specifically, but you can at least tell me which intelligence discipline you're in. Is it human intelligence or signals intelligence or imagery intelligence, whatever? And they said, none of those. And I go, none of those? But there isn't anything else. That's it. There's Mazint. I asked about that too. They said, no, there's it's none of those. I said, okay. I said, trying to figure it out, elicit some information. I said, well, tell me this. Do you travel a lot in what you do? And
how do they choose to answer that question? Because it could be yes or no or both.
Well, Tom says, well, sort of. Oh, what we sort of, this is probably June or July of 1983 when we're having this conversation, just to give you the time hack. And so that was the end of that conversation. I'm totally mystified, totally unenlightened, and thinking whatever it is they do must be pretty darn interesting. So anyway, fast forward to, I want to say it's probably August, might have been late July, early August. And I get a knock on the door and it's Tom and Skip. And I said, well, come on in. This is like at lunchtime or something. And they said, we think you might be good at what we do. I said, what do you do? And hoping they'd tell me this time. I said, well, we can't tell you, but what we're going to do is we're going to give you some tests to take. And if you score within the parameters that we're looking for, then we'll bring you on board. Or we'll bring you in, we'll read you on, and you'll have an opportunity to volunteer, right? Mm-hmm. So I scored apparently where they wanted, because invited me in over to the offices, which were only about a 5-minute walk from our quarters, it turned out. And these old beat-up ramshackle buildings that dated to World War II. They were temporary buildings back then. Paint was peeling off the outside. There was metal gratings over the windows, and it was the front porches creaked as you went up, front porch steps creaked as you went up them. And so I go in, and Tom takes me in the back and sits me down, and he says, okay, here, sign this. And I had to fill out this, well, civilians would call it non-disclosure agreement. It was a read-on statement for a special access program, and it was compartmented in certain ways. And it was really, of course, I was read on at that point too.
So you had like a TS SCI clearance, basically.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for, TS SCI, yeah. And of course, those read-on statements are pretty serious as well. But this was even more than that. It was like, you can't tell anybody you're in the Army that doesn't already know. You have to disallow any or deny any connection to the military when you're away from the post and that kind of thing. And a bunch of other stuff. It reminded me, I like to compare this to that scene in Men in Black where Tommy Lee Jones is reading on Will Smith to the Men in Black program and says, you'll have to sever all human connections, have your fingerprints erased, that kind of stuff. That. And so I signed it. And then Tom says, okay, well, what we do here is that we collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychological discipline called remote viewing. we're essentially inviting you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And I'm going, and he says, now you don't have to tell me until tomorrow. You can go home, and these are the things you can tell your wife about this, because it does involve a significant career change. And I said, no, don't. I don't need to do that. I'm definitely accepting this. I'm volunteering for this. And he looked kind of stunned, but what he didn't know was some of my background, which was, as a kid, I had loved, and up through, young adulthood, I loved reading science fiction. And I really liked science fiction involved extrasensory perception, ESP, like Andre Norton's Psychic Cats or Zena Henderson's Pilgrimage series, that kind of thing, right? And then I had been involved in a science fair project in junior high that involved ESP, reading the Zener cards. We've got the wavy lines and the stars and stuff you see at the beginning of Ghostbusters. Right? I was involved in that. It was a total failure. Nobody had any evidence of any kind of psychic functioning. So I'd become a kind of a mild skeptic. And as he's telling me this about this, I'm thinking, I used to really be interested in ESP. I'd failed in that case, but I always thought it would have been nice if it was true, right? Mm-hmm. He's telling me that there is a line item in the federal budget that pays for people to be trained in using ESP to spy on the Russians or whoever. I said, that means it's got to be real. There's no way I'm not doing this. Yeah. So he was kind of startled. Within 30 seconds, I had already volunteered to be assigned.
Going back a few moments ago, you mentioned that there was a test that they gave you.
Yeah.
What did that test consist of?
There's actually several tests. Most of them were basic personality and psychology tests. Like there's the MMPI, which I think is Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, something like that. There was the Myers-Briggs, the extended.
What was your Myers-Briggs type indicator?
I am a radical ENTP.
Okay.
I kind of pigged out in extroversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving. Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah, I am a ISTJ.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh no, that's nice. You're actually almost exactly opposite of me. In fact, you've got the same profile as my wife. So,
oh boy.
Yeah. So
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
What that means is we would never get along. No, just kidding. Actually, you're complementary. It works pretty well. You each fill in the gaps that the other one has in their personality. So they're mostly just standard. There was a couple that one had been developed by the INSCOM. That's the intelligence organization.
Intelligence and Security Command, right?
Yeah. Well, the INSCOM staff psychologist that was to try to assess how near in personality you were to other people who had been successful in the remote viewing program. But that was pretty much it. They were pretty straightforward. But I'll tell you the other criteria they're looking for, because I know that'll be the next question. How did they pick me? The guidance they had gotten from the people who were researching this, folks out at what used to be known as Stanford Research Institute, now called SRI International, was that you wanted someone who was competent in the profession they were involved in. So in that case, that meant being a successful intelligence officer, above average intelligence, which, despite rumors of the contrary, most intelligence officers are, right? And then, in addition to all your military qualifications, having a pursuit, a hobby, an interest in a creative venture of some kind. So, for example, studio art, you paint or whatever, music, perform, you have musical, you play musical instrument, whatever, foreign languages. And that, of course, isn't so uncommon in the intelligence world, but still, and various kinds of some kind of creative activity. Well, as they got to know me, they had seen some of my artwork on the wall. I had majored in art at BYU before I shifted to Middle Eastern Studies. I'd illustrated some textbooks and science papers and stuff at BYU. Mm-hmm. I had played guitar since I was 17. I had, and I like to write short stories and send them off and get them rejected. And of course, I was fluent in German and had been trained in Arabic and Hebrew, although I was a little rusty by then. So they kind of got to know me and said, well, we can't not try this guy out. Right. And it worked out. So that's how that all came to be.
Okay, so you say yes to joining the unit. What comes next? Well,
the first thing was they gave me essentially a and a chance to try it. There's a lot of studying for the first month or two I was in the unit. I read Targ and Puthoff's Mind Reach. I read Walt Collier's Mind to Mind, stuff like that. They gave us a bunch of reading material. And I read some stuff on my own, stuff like some of the more esoteric literature, because I didn't really know what the quality stuff was, what was relevant and what wasn't. So like Ruth Montgomery's works and stuff, and she's very much kind of a medium and such. And that was useful education. Didn't really help so much with remote viewing, but it was useful to kind of know the domain out there, of the more paranormal kind of things. And then they gave me a chance to try it before we started training in January. And that was what we call an outbounder, where some folks that go to a target that you don't know what it is. And then your job is to home in on them and thereby also discover the location and describe the location where they are. They act as a kind of a beacon to mark the location of where you're supposed to mentally go. And you do that totally blind. You have no idea where they went. And so I did that, and it was a mixed success. So the target was this massive water tower, but I described the donut shop where they stopped in after they were done. My father-in-law joked, he said, "Trust you to go to the donuts."
Where was it locally that they were going around Fort Meade, or was it?
Yeah, the standard model is it's within 15 minutes to a half an hour drive from where you are. Because the way it works is they go to the target, you're sequestered in a closed room, and then you remote view where they are. And I did not remote view a water tower. Anyways, and then when they come back, they pick you up and take you to the actual location for the feedback. They don't even tell you what it is until you actually get on site. That was the model. But unfortunately, they made the mistake of stopping at the donut store as well. So that became part of the target feedback, right?
Was it before or after they reached the target, they stopped in the donut shop?
Yes, that was a mistake. We should have stopped in the donut shop after we had gone back to the target and then done that. But, that's the way it goes. In a way, it was actually, in some ways, more confirming to me than if I had gotten the water tower. But Skip said, as we're driving back, he figured out what was going on long before I ever did. We're driving by, and I suddenly look over across the street, and I said, "What's that?" And Skip says, without even listening to me, he says, "Lesson to be learned." He says, "If you don't get the target, it doesn't matter what you get instead."
Yeah.
And so that was a good lesson to me, that you do the mission. And if you don't do the mission, it doesn't matter how psychic you are, you've still blown it. Right?
Well, I think Laurie Williams would say that if you get excited about missing the target but getting something else right, it's like a negative training effect on your subconscious.
It's bad reinforcement.
Yeah.
Yep, that is correct.
Okay, so mixed success-ish for your first target. Was that like a culminating event before you went operational, or is that just a step on the path to?
That was just a step on the path. Skip wanted you to get your feet wet before you actually went to training, and so he'd run us on ERVs. I know I did that one. I might have run another one before we went. I'm not remembering clearly about that.
And did they give you any prep training, or was it just tell us what you can see, just try to follow us?
Throw you in the deep end of the pool and see if you swim. Yeah. No, well, there was a little bit. As many folks know these days, Skip was actually quite integrated with the Monroe Institute. He'd gone down there and done their training and developed a relationship with Bob Monroe and brought up some hemisync tapes. This is before they were actually marketing them to the general public. Bob let him take some Focus 10, Focus 12 tapes and bring them up and use those as a what we often call cool down, right? To get us started, but getting you into that mind. This was what we called extended remote viewing, or ERV, where you're in a bed, laying on a bed. And I used to joke we were the only unit in the entire DOD that had a bed as part of our operational equipment. So anyway, get this, set up this mind-awake body asleep condition, which they thought allowed you to remote view more accurately. I have my doubts about that, but it works for a lot of people.
Probably put you in the wrong, well, not the wrong, but I think you're supposed to be in an alpha wave state to remote view. But
that stuff about brainwaves is nonsense.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it is. The SRI research showed that it doesn't matter what brain state you're in, you can still remote view. Yeah. So what it did was actually put you in alpha, frankly, or a little bit like that, which didn't hurt anything. It just did, in my opinion, didn't help. The idea was that if you get closer to your subconscious, as you would be in a case like that, get you closer to subconscious, then you get less mental noise, what we call analytical overlay, which is the left brain interference, right? To me, it didn't make any difference at all. I had just as much AOL either way.
Well, my understanding is that as time went on, for cool down, you would use heavy metal. Is that correct?
And we can talk about that in a bit.
Well, who was your go-to? I have to ask. What was your go-to band?
I like them all, but I use AC/DC as the paradigm, right?
Okay.
Is probably I like more AC/DC, a higher percentage of AC/DC songs than I do of any other metal band. Right. Generally speaking, I don't like all of anything. Right. There are songs I like, songs I don't like, but AC/DC probably formed the backbone of my playlist. But I even had a couple of Dolly Parton songs on my playlist. And, I have a wide variety and the goal was not so much the genre. Okay, we're talking about my cool down now, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
The goal wasn't necessarily, the genre wasn't what was important, is how it made me feel. To me, so cool down, let me back up. The idea of cool down is that before you do a session, you try and get yourself in a state of mind that's conducive to being successful, right? And some people think, well, you try and blank your mind out. No, first of all, you can't do it. Second of all, you don't want to do that. If you blank your mind out, then it also blanks out the signal, right? Mm-hmm. To me, it was kind of get myself, because I always have doubts before I do a session. Is it going to work this time? Can I do it? Am I going to blow it this time? I always have those doubts. So for me, the playlist, and this is, of course, on the old Walkman, cassette players, right? I mixed those tapes myself. The goal it was kind of like a halftime pep talk that the coach gives his players to get them back up and fighting out on the field, right? So to me, it was kind of a mental encouragement. Yes, I can do this. Yes, I go in with a positive emotion, that I'm going to succeed at this. And that's how a cool down really wasn't cool down. It was more of a ramping up, right? But still, that's the term we use it. Some people did cool down. And like I said, I didn't find that particularly beneficial, the cooling down, calming down. It was more get myself excited, stimulated, ready to go. And that worked pretty well for me. So.
Okay. So you go through this initial training and then you go operational. What sorts of targets, to the extent that you can discuss them, did they deploy you against?
The very first operational target we did, and we did it before we were even operational. We did it. I think we've been partly through our stage 4 training of a total of 6 stages. Was Enrique Camarena, who was a DEA agent, who had been kidnapped by a cartel in El Paso and taken across the border and tortured and killed in a hacienda in northern Mexico. Of course, nobody knew where they were. And so they even came to us. And by this time, our main viewer, that was Joe McMoneagle, and a lot of your folks probably know who Joe McMoneagle was. Joe McMoneagle had retired. Lynn Buchanan had come on, and we were just in the process of training him. I had, and I was one of his main trainers at the time. We even used him, as I recall. I don't remember how far into his training he was, but I think we even used him, even though he was, of course, not nearly as far along as we were at that time. And all of us worked the project, and it was our first time doing a real world one. Everything had been training for that. And interestingly, we never got official feedback, but my session, the next day they found out where he was and found his body, and they had images, on the news of where he was, and my sketches matched it. I was quite impressed because I hadn't really felt like I was getting anything that was worthwhile. But that taught me a lesson that remote viewers are the last ones in the world to know whether they're actually on or not. If you think you are on, very often you're not. If you think you're off, very often you are. And so one of the things you learn from that, I talk about remote viewing being a very Zen experience. This parallel occurred to me back even at Fort Meade. I'm thinking, well, this is really kind of Zen, because you have to let go of any investment in the outcome. If you're focused on the outcome, you're going to mess up. Yeah, it brings to mind this Far Side cartoon where the guy playing the cymbals in the orchestra, he's back in the back and he's got this thought bubble. This time I'm not going to mess up. This time I'm not going to mess up. This time I'm not going to mess up. And the caption is Harry messes up. Because he's gotten so busy focusing on not messing up that he forgot to pick up the other symbol. He's only got one. So if that's the thing you have to avoid in remote viewing, is focusing so much on being successful, focus so much on not failing, that you actually do fail, mess up. It's like, and the Zen element is in Zen, you're supposed to focus on process, not outcome. In Zen archery, it's all about how you grasp the bow, how you knock the arrow, how you draw back, your breathing, how you release, and whether or not you hit the target has to be secondary to doing the process. And if you succeed in that in remote viewing, you increase the chances you're going to be successful dramatically by not worrying about success.
And did you find that you became, the more operations that you did, the better you became, or was it kind of you reach a steady state early on and it remains?
That's hard to assess what counts as a certain level of success, right? Because with remote viewing, it's never 100%. Sometimes you screw up and don't make it, don't get it, and sometimes you do get it, and which is normal. We don't know what the boundary conditions of this are, right? We don't know what the causality is. We don't know how remote viewing works in terms of signal and reception, all that. We generally know how to behave in a way that increases your chances of succeeding, but we don't know how to measure ultimately how all of that comes together. So it's very much an art, even more than a science, obviously. So I had more significant successes later on in my career. Yeah, I guess I got better as time went on. And I've watched other viewers that seem to get better as time goes on, but it still doesn't mean you're not going to screw up. You're going to, I shouldn't say screw up, because things happen no matter how hard how much you're trying to apply the correct principles. And it probably has to do with the uncertainties and unknowns of the process itself. So, I mean, in baseball is a good example. You get folks, the really good batters hit, what is it, a third of the time, and they get better and better over the time, but they reach a certain plateau, and it doesn't go beyond that because there are variables over which they have no control. And that's kind of the way it is remote viewing. So yeah, I don't feel like I really answered your question, and yet answered it sort of.
No, I think you did. I think much like anything else, right? There's probably a very steep improvement in the very beginning, because you literally go from zero to being able to use the ability relatively quickly. And then, it's kind of like an S curve, just like everything else, launching a new product. But at some point you're going to hit the limit as that curve approaches infinity is going to be pretty fixed. So what's the weirdest target, either operational or in training, you had to?
Fort Meade, I've had weirder ones since.
Well, I think in the next episode we'll talk about the weirder ones.
Yeah.
At Fort Meade, what was the strangest?
So that's a hard one, because most of the time we were doing practical targets, real world targets, right? There were some unsettling ones and surprising ones, but weird ones were probably ones we weren't supposed to be doing anyway, like UFO ET targets. And those we as viewers didn't choose to do. Those got chosen for us, because one of the things people don't understand often about remote viewing is that you can't know what, as a viewer, you can't know what the target is up front, because if you do, it will mess the process up dramatically. There are folks out there, some of my former colleagues, notoriously one of them, who swears that you can remote view 100% correct all the time. Front loaded means you know the target. The evidence shows that he's totally wrong about that. So,
rhymes with med teams.
Could be. Yeah, could be. The problem is that when you're remote viewing front loaded, that everything you already know about the target or can guess about it is right there in your head. And it can lead you off totally off the signal. In fact, it tends to blanket, to smother the actual subtle signal coming in with the information that you don't know about it, because you're so busy trying to sort out what you do know or what can guess about it in your head. If you're blind to the target, that's much less of a problem. And you tend to be more accurate, much more accurate, if you don't know what the target is than if you do. So, well, in this same person, Schmed Thames, or whatever you said, the same person would often, I don't say often, but often enough would spring these, you thought you were doing an operational target, and he'd spring these UFO or UT targets on you. And so some of those were pretty strange. But I also, well, let me add a qualification here. Skip Atwater would occasionally do that also. But Skip would do it with a proper protocol. Yeah, that's a whole topic of conversation, how you do it properly. But he would do it in a way I trusted. Our other friend, Ted, as Lynn Buchanan calls him.
Would it be fair to say, because again, I'm interpreting this, but one person might present it to you as just, here's today's target, and not paint it in any way, whereas the other person might say, we're going to view an operational target somewhere in the world, and then it turned out to be like a UFO.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is Skip at least would present these enigma targets or anomaly targets, as I call them. He'd give them to you as a training target. You say there's a training target, right? But he also restricted the kinds of targets to events or phenomena that there was at least strong reason to believe actually there was something to it.
There's some evidence, like the Phoenix lights people saw, that you could at least somewhat corroborate.
Yes, and okay. At least that there was reason to believe there might be something there. So I might as well just say Ed Dames. Everybody's figured out it was Ed Dames by now. Ed would often just give you totally speculative targets. Like one he liked to use was the Supreme Galactic Council or something like that. Well, there's no evidence there is a Supreme Galactic Council. That's pure speculation. And I would never run a remote viewer on a speculative target like that, because it's really bad for their functioning as a remote viewer ultimately. And it invites all kinds of misunderstandings and misperceptions and stuff. And so a lot of our targets were like that from Ed. And so, yeah, they were weird, but legitimately weird, or is it just something that your brain made up because there wasn't an actual target, so.
To the extent that you're comfortable with discussing this, what was the most unsettling target you did while you were at Fort Meade?
That was the one that disturbed me the most. It was an accident in a Soviet biochemical warfare lab.
Interesting.
The Soviets had the facility, and I don't recall much of the details of this. You could look it up. There's an accident in a biowarfare lab. There's an underground facility. A bunch of people died, apparently. Of course, obviously, it's hard to get records about that even now. Appears a bunch of people died. And I came into the session and kind of linked up with a guy that was in the process of choking to death. And I recognized that. And I even experienced, it's a mental experience of his distress,
Bilocation, basically.
Yeah, although we should talk about bilocation because I've been using that term wrong, as have a bunch of other people. But essentially, I identified a little too much with the person I discovered at the target. And that was distressful. It's kind of traumatic. It wasn't horrible for me. I was able to get over it. But at the time, it was disturbing, right? And so that's probably the one target that really I found unsettling or unpleasant.
What outbreak, like what pathogen was?
Oh, I don't know. And in fact, I think it was probably chemical, right, actually.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. And then since you've left the unit, since you've retired, what sorts of things have you used remote viewing for since? So,
of course, my main focus has always been training. And I'll get to and answer your question here in a minute. So, and the reason I focus mainly on training is because I feel like we need to leave a bunch of trained remote viewers behind. Some folks like Joe McMonagle, he didn't believe you can train it. I hear he's changed his tune recently, but I don't know. He believed that you either could do it or you couldn't, and training wouldn't make a difference, right? And so he did a lot of operational remote viewing, but he didn't train anybody. And so when he passes on, then away goes the resource too, because he didn't leave anyone behind who could also do it. And I figure I get more bang for the buck, both literally and figuratively, teaching other people how to do it in the proper way. And so that there is a installed base, so to speak, left behind when I either retire or kick the bucket, which ultimately, presumably I will. Nobody believes that's going to happen to him until it does. Right. So anyway, but I do it operationally sometimes, right? I used to do it more. The problem with an operational project is it takes a huge amount of time that could maybe be used more productive, like by teaching other people how to do it, and then let them do the operational stuff, right? So I've done a number of missing persons cases. I've done some corporate espionage stuff. One case where there was a corporate mole in a large company. They knew the mole was there, but they couldn't quite identify who it was. So their chief security officer asked me to try and do that. So we did a project on it. In fact, we described a person, and it matched the description of somebody who was under suspicion anyway. And so that was kind of confirmatory for them. We did one corporate espionage where one company believed that another company had stolen some intellectual property, industrial process, and they had tried to find out conventionally and were unsuccessful. So a mutual competitive intelligence company that they hired to do it was Phoenix Consulting Group, and the principal's name was John Nolan, who's a good friend of mine, and had actually been on the periphery of all this stuff when he was an Army officer at Army Operations Group. The same time I was there. He was, in fact, what we call the Colonel's Twilight Zone officer, because his assignment was to research some of this bleeding edge human potential stuff, and remote viewing was part of that mix. In fact, he had a nameplate on his desk that was Carmine G. Tizio, T-I-Z-I-O, which stood for Twilight Zone officer, right? Because he was a counterintelligence and human intelligence guy, so he often had alternate identities when he was doing that kind of work, and so that was his alternate identity. As you can see, I tend to squirrel. I get off the topic sometimes. Right?
No, it's interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, John owned this company, and so he thought, well, maybe remote viewing can help. So he approached me, and we did it. And 10 years pass. Might have been longer than that. Might have been almost 20. And we never got any feedback on our results. Was it useful? Was it not? Nobody ever told us. So I'm talking to John, I guess it was about a year or two ago. And I said, by the way, whatever happened with that project we did for you? And he said, didn't you hear anything back on that? I said, no. Oh, well, they brought the data you produced. There had this confrontation between the lawyers of the two companies. They brought your data in and presented it to the lawyers of the corporation, and they immediately settled.
Did they tell them where? They probably didn't tell them where it came from.
Tell them where the information came from. But when the corporation that had committed the intellectual property theft saw what the information was that the victim company had, they immediately rolled over and said, "Okay, we're going to settle."
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So you don't have to answer this question, but I ask everybody this question. Does the U.S. government still use this program?
Yeah, of course, that question comes up all the time. And my answer is, I doubt it. Okay. And I can't say absolutely no. It's hard to prove a negative, particularly when you're no longer on the inside. Mm-hmm. But people say, well, the CIA still got a program going on. Well, I'm pretty sure they don't. Hal Puthoff and I were approached a few years back by essentially it was a second tier executive from the CIA about the possibility of starting up a program. That never went anywhere because the director nixed the idea. We got that from the person who approached us. But if they're coming to ask us how we start a program, they don't have a program.
What about you? What about them using contractors?
Well, that has happened off and on. particularly during the early days of the War on Terror, right? I and my group got asked to provide remote viewing services to try and find a missing MP who had been kidnapped by Al-Qaeda in Iraq during convoy. They attacked a convoy and they took this guy off. So we were asked to do that. And I know that they have asked other people opportunistically. Usually it's actually the mid-level operator level. So you get a case officer or somebody, who has some intel contingency funds, that money that they can use at their discretion to try and acquire information. And they may approach a remote viewer and say, hey, can you do this? And I can pay you X amount of dollars. But generally speaking, the people way up the food chain, the people who actually are the major decision makers, they don't want to have anything to do with it. It just
they don't want to be connected with it because they might think it's too woo-woo or something.
Yeah. But it does happen. And I also acknowledge it's possible that NSA has a program. There are some little tantalizing tidbits that suggest they might. They did have one. It was just a small one compared to ours back when I was being trained. And I never heard anywhere they canceled it. And on top of that, every once in a while, something comes out from a fairly reliable sources that maybe they do have a program, but there's nothing concrete about it. So I say there's a 98% chance nothing is going on in terms of any official or even a sub rosa program. But there's always a 2% chance there might be. I like to repeat something Lynn Buchanan says. He says, when he gets asked that question, I've heard him respond, well, if there was a program going on, I don't have a clearance anymore, so I would just say I can't tell you because I wouldn't know. He says, if there was a program going on and I knew about it, it would be classified. So I'd have to say I can't tell you. So I'm just going to say I can't tell you. He might have even used that in your interview with him.
Yeah, I think he did. He absolutely did.
It's become a cliche, sorry.
So the Russians and the Chinese, do you think they're still using this?
I don't think the Russians are. It's uncertain if the Chinese are. I know that in their culture, things similar like Qigong and stuff like that, that's stuff that's accepted in their culture. Being a Marxist government, it's hard to see whether they would allow it in or not, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
And then while you were in the remote viewing program, were you ever approached or surveilled by the KGB, GRU?
No.
That you know of?
Well, I'm pretty confident that I wasn't, even if I didn't know about it, right? One of the reasons for the high classification program is because the only way to guarantee that somebody's not going to remote view you is to take them out, right? And so the highest level of protection in the program wasn't for the fact that government was involved or what our targets were. It was the identity of the viewers and the personnel. That was the highest level of classification, what we called CL4. CL1 being kind of confidential, CL4 being really tight. And you had to have really good reason to be read onto that level of access in the program. And very, very, very few people did. And they were very well vetted. So I really don't think so. I don't think I think the Soviets probably knew there was some kind of program going on, but they didn't know where it was. And they didn't know who was in it. I'm quite confident of that. And so, yeah, no.
Now, you mentioned you teach remote viewing. If people want to take a course with you or actually read your book as well, A, what's the title of the book? Where can they find it? And then B, how can they sign up for classes?
So
I'll put the information in the description below.
Okay. So first off, I have two books that are worthwhile, I think. Of course, I think they are. My first one was called Reading the Enemy's Mind, Inside Stargate, America's Psychic Espionage Program. And that is more of, I hate to call it a history because people panic. They say, I don't want to read a history book, But it really was. I documented the program starting when it very first started all the way up to its end. And I did a ton of research on this book. Most of the books you read out there from my colleagues are memoirs, and they're done mostly out of their own memories. And consequently, it's very self-centric, and the details aren't there. And many of what appear to be facts are actually wrong because they're misremembering things, right? I knew that was a risk when I started my book. And so I have interviews from somewhere over 50 of the principal people involved in the program. I dug up as many documents as I could and referred to as many documents as were available. Now, there's parts that I had to fill in with memory, but I tried to check my memories with other people who were there at the same time. So that book is in fact, both Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff, who are obviously the main people in getting this going.
Speaking of which, Ingo Swann's picture looks like right behind you, I think.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Although he does look a little bit like Zelensky too. So just
well, they're both great guys, right?
Yeah, that's right.
so, and I see you're trying to rock that look a little bit too. So yeah.
I not intentionally.
Well, facial hair kind of has the same look on everybody, but no.
Yeah.
So yeah, in fact, that's a photo that he personally signed and gave to me. I was very flattered by that he did that. I had no idea. So anyway, the two of them, both of them said that book was the best book that's ever been written on the program. So I felt like that was a good endorsement. In fact, Hal bought, I want to say he bought about a dozen copies and gave them to all his friends.
Yeah, actually, when I asked David Morehouse about which book covers the history the best, he recommended your book as well.
Well, that was nice of him. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And second book, what was the second book? Sorry,
Yeah. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent. The second book is probably the one best for people who are interested in remote viewing per se. Now, the first book, I do talk a lot about our training, about a lot of the theory and stuff. This book is a kind of a survey of the field. It's called The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. And the point of it is, it's like, you take a survey class in the university, they cover all the topics associated. This one covers all the topics. It deals with some of the more remarkable projects that were worked and results. It deals with the science behind it. What is remote viewing in the first place, and how does it fit in with all these other psychic abilities people have? I talk about the science behind it, and I talk about the skeptical arguments against it and the arguments against the skeptical arguments. And there are basically 3 chapters in there that actually tell you how to do it yourself at a basic, foundational level, and give you some exercises that you can work. And then there's a chapter showing 2 chapters on actual results, the statistical results from the research, and then actual, what we call prima facie results, showing actual results and how it compares to the targets. And there's some quite stunning results there to see. So, and so on from there. The book is a very thorough but easy introduction to remote viewing for people who it's for people who are just getting acquainted with it, or it's for people who are acquainted with it but have friends and family who wonder what this weird thing is they're involved in. They can give this to their family without fear of scaring them away, or their friends. And then it's for people who are in remote viewing but they have holes in their knowledge and would like to try and fill those holes in. So that's it. That's why I call it the Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, because it'll give you an awesome foundation to what this weird stuff is that we're doing.
Now, while this episode won't air before Black Friday, it will air before Christmas. So if you need some Christmas gift ideas for people who are notoriously difficult to buy things for, both of those books could be interesting gifts. Now, the classes that you offer.
You have become my latest hero.
well, we'll see. We'll see how many sales you get. It all depends on that.
And it's available. There's a website for it, but it's most easily available on Amazon, obviously. So, yeah. And
then courses that you teach. Where can folks?
Yes. So I teach, first of all, the controlled remote viewing, which is a specialized form of remote viewing that Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff developed, which is aimed at helping people who've never been psychic or never remote viewed before, help them become very proficient at it. And you can find out about those at my website, which is rviewer.com, the letter R, the word viewer, so RVIE.
And it'll be down in the link.
Yeah.
Just click there.
Thanks.
All right, my friend, it was a pleasure meeting you, and I look forward to many such discussions.
I'm sure there's a lot I could talk about.
I know there is. Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much.
You betcha. It's been fun.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.